Thanks, Bob. And thanks all for coming. Basically, I want to start by showing this introductory slide. I think it's this satellite image really, while it only shows a small part of the Great Barrier Reef, I think it depicts very well some of the diversity that I'll be talking about. Certainly in things like the fringing reefs, they're hard to see at that scale. But if you look at the mid-shelf reefs or the amazing ribbon reefs on the outer edge, I think this is the diversity that we all know in the Great Barrier Reef. It also depicts just how little is actually of the Great Barrier Reef is made up of reefs. Only about 7% of the entire Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is actually made up of coral reefs. So there's vast interreefal areas. The satellite image also shows the deep and dark blue areas out here. And you can see that the marine park boundary is well outside the outer reef. So it is much bigger than the outer reefs. So this is the narrowest part of the reef. You can see here in this depiction. The boundary of the Great Barrier Reef is enormous, and it is, as I said, well outside the reefs. Within this area, we've got huge and important biodiversity, spread over about 14 degrees of latitude and over an incredible depth range, as I said, from the shallow inshore areas right out to that deep water over 2,500 metres deep. So we've got basically remarkable cross-shelf and latitudinal diversity in the Great Barrier Reef. Probably in terms of marine protected areas, greater biodiversity in this area than any other MPA worldwide. And some of that national or international significance is things like 1/3 of the soft coral and sea pen species found within the GBR. 6 of the 7 species of marine turtles found in the world are in the GBR. Over half the mangrove species known. Globally significant seabird breeding areas. And about 13% of all the known sea stars and sea cucumbers are found in the GBR. So this international biodiversity is why it's been internationally recognised as a World Heritage Area, inscribed in 1981, really recognising both the biodiversity, the geomorphology and the amazing aesthetics of the area. But it's also nationally and regionally known. It's been obviously known to the Aboriginal traditional owners for over 40,000 years. It's been well recognised and long recognised as a multiple use area by European people. And today it's worth about $6 billion to the Australian economy every year. So there's a number of key activities that contribute to that $6 billion. Things like the commercial fishing, recreational fishing. These other ones aren't so much in the $6 billion, but it's worth a huge amount in terms of shipping. The tourism is certainly part of the $6 billion. Research, and it's an important area for all the people who live adjacent to the Great Barrier Reef. About 1 million live in the adjacent catchments. The marine park was declared in 1975 and it covers a huge area, 344,000 square kilometres. If you look at these global comparisons on the side here, you'll see it's bigger than many countries in the world. The boundaries are also important. I mentioned the offshore boundary is well outside the reefs, way offshore. But the inner boundary, a lot of people don't understand, starts at low water mark, which is not a particularly helpful boundary, but it's in law, the inner boundary of the Great Barrier Reef. Also, only 70 of the islands within that outer boundary are actually part of the marine park. Even though we've got about 1,000 islands within the outer area, most of them are under Queensland jurisdiction. The zoning has long been regarded as one of our key tools for managing the area. It's a key spatial tool, and many people are aware of it. So the zoning started in the 1980s, and through to 2004 it looked like that. But in the late 1990s, we recognised that the zoning that existed for the Great Barrier Reef wasn't actually doing what it was intended to do. It wasn't protecting the biodiversity of the Great Barrier Reef. And so today we've moved to a zoning plan that looks like that. And that was really, in 2004, brought into law because it was designed to better protect the biodiversity of the Great Barrier Reef. The process to go from that old zoning to the new zoning was quite complex. Many of you have seen this flow diagram before, but effectively, after we realised that the old zoning plans weren't protecting the biodiversity, we went through a process of collecting data and working with experts, scientific experts. So we collated over 40 data sets, and we used that to produce a map of bioregions, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. We also used the experts to help develop a series of what we call planning principles. And it was that combination of planning principles and the bioregions that really provided the scientific underpinning for the whole of the Great Barrier Reef rezoning. However, law also requires us to engage the public, and we had a community participation, a formal phase, before we produced the draft plan. And then we got the comments from the public on the second phase, on the draft plan. And it was together, those two phases, that really made huge changes from the draft to the final before we actually took the plan to Parliament. It was also this lower area here that was really where the politicians got involved. So I want to stress the scientific underpinning at the start was fundamental, but really the latter part of the rezoning was really about politics and about community. The zoning plan was based, as I said, on a really important map of bioregions. This was the scientific underpinning of the rezoning. It was done to the best of our ability using the best available knowledge with the experts. It was developed by Gabrumpa in that period, 1999 to 2000. We mapped 70 bioregions, and again, as I stressed, those were the basis upon which we did our rezoning. But I want to stress that zoning, whilst it's a fundamentally important tool, doesn't really address all the pressures facing us. If we think about things like water quality, zoning doesn't apply outside the Marine Park, and yet most of those issues of water quality are coming from outside. Zoning does address some of the issues of fishing, but not all aspects of unsustainable fishing. Zoning can help build resilience for climate change, but it's certainly not addressing all the issues of climate change that we know are happening. In terms of ports and coastal developments, zoning doesn't apply actually in the port areas that are outside the Marine Park. And when we're talking about shipping, whilst the zoning plan itself has shipping lanes in law, it doesn't actually control huge aspects of the shipping. And so when we get groundings or pollution incidents, the zoning isn't the thing that helps address those. And increasing population and recreational growth, these things again aren't addressed by zoning. And on top of that, the cumulative impacts of all these pressures, again, zoning is not addressing it. So whilst zoning is a fundamental tool, a really critical one, it's not the only thing we use for our management of the Great Barrier Reef. If we talk about marine protected areas globally, there's now over 5,800 MPAs set up, and they're growing every year. They cover about 2.8% of the entire ocean, but only 1% of that is what we call no-take or marine reserves. Many of these MPAs, unfortunately, are paper parks. Whilst they've been declared either by law or other legislative basis, they don't really have effective planning or management. Yet we've got the Convention on Biodiversity setting biodiversity targets for 2020, and many countries are signatories to this convention, that basically says 10% of the world's oceans should be in protected areas, coastal marine areas. So what we're going to see is many, many more countries developing MPAs in the next decade. In terms of writing up things about rezoning and the Great Barrier Reef management, there has been a lot over the years addressing these sort of key aspects. There's been a range of authors, and Leanne Fernandez, sitting in the audience, was one of my co-workers when we did this, has published a lot on this. Similarly, in terms of management planning, over the last 30 years, there's been a fair bit written, and I've highlighted there some of the key journals that these things have been published in. However, I think there are many aspects that still need to be addressed. Things like the role of politics and leadership, particularly in the rezoning, the representative areas program. Things like the additional lessons we've learnt in terms of the rezoning. The methods that we used and the role, how we engage the community. Fundamentally important, yet it hasn't been written up, I believe, the way it needs to. And there's lots of misunderstandings out there in terms of what MPA management, how we manage the reef. And I think it's also important to think about a future rezoning. One day it'll happen. The law basically says the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park will have a zoning plan. We do have one, and it's doing a pretty good job, and I'll demonstrate that shortly. But down the track, if the Minister makes a decision, we need to think about the lessons we've learned from the current zoning for our next zoning. So I think these are what I regard as key knowledge gaps that I'd like to address during my thesis. What do I bring to this project? As Bob indicated, I've been doing this for a while now. I've had 39 years of experience as a protected area manager and planner, 28 of which have been based in the Great Barrier Reef. During that time, I've been involved in field management, planning, and now I'm heavily involved in World Heritage. As Bob said, I was heavily involved in the rezoning, the representative areas program, and I'm lucky enough to have been able to travel around and talk to people around the world in terms of what we've done and how we've done it. So I'm aware of what they know and many of their misunderstandings. So again, I think it's really important to recognise some of those gaps and where we need to go. So what are the aims and objectives of my thesis or my project? I've got three primary aims. Firstly, to assess the significant lessons learned over 30 years of conservation planning and management in the Great Barrier Reef. Second one, and in particular, reflect on the lessons learned from the rezoning and the representative areas program. The second primary aim, to guide what should be considered for any future zoning programs. Again, I think this is really fundamental. We need to start thinking now for the future. And thirdly, to provide effective guidance for new and emerging MPAs around the world, especially large MPAs. Again, I'll demonstrate why I think that's important. I've posed 4 research questions that I'd like to try and address. The first research question, if we assume that the scientific underpinning was fundamental in achieving the outcomes of RAP, how important were both leadership and politics in achieving the effective outcome? My second question, given that the 2003 zoning network was based on the best science available, how effective was that 2003 zoning in protecting new habitats and the subsequent discoveries that we found in the Great Barrier Reef? We've learned an awful lot, which again I'll demonstrate shortly. So how effective was that 2003 network? My third question, if a rezoning was to be contemplated in the future, what would be the key lessons arising from the 2003 zoning that could assist in any foreseeable rezoning? And my fourth question, if we assume some of the lessons about planning and management have been documented, is there sufficient guidance available for other large MPAs around the world to learn from our experience? I've given myself 4 measurable objectives for this project. And again, these are things I've just basically mentioned. Clearly articulate the key elements that contributed to the Representative Areas Program, or otherwise known as RAP. To document the lessons learned from the RAP and the subsequent management that needs to be considered for any future rezoning. To determine how effective the rezoning was in protecting the range of biodiversity that we now know exists in the Great Barrier Reef. And lastly, in terms of objectives, to document the implications for planning and management for large MPAs elsewhere. So I think they're all measurable, and I think I can, at the end of my thesis, determine whether I've achieved those objectives. So how am I proposing to go about it? What I'm proposing is a thesis that will have 7 chapters, and I'd like to take you through each of those 7 chapters. The first one is an introduction. Basically, obviously I'll introduce the overall thesis, but I'm keen to talk about how does the management of the Great Barrier Reef compare to other large MPAs, and there are huge differences. On which of the lessons learned from the Great Barrier Reef and the implications of those lessons will be useful for other large MPAs. Some of you may know the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, Papahanaumokuakea, is the large MPA that's set up there. That's really the only other one in the world that's actually documented their management. There's a whole group of people, and they've set themselves up now called Big Oceans, to try and get together and learn. But as I'll demonstrate, there's a lot out there in terms of MPAs, but not a lot of information upon which to draw. So what we've got is an emerging trend globally of large marine protected areas. For decades, the Great Barrier Reef was the largest, and many people saw it as the largest, and it's still probably well known as the largest MPA. But the reality is, whilst it's 344,000 square kilometres, today, if you look at a list of MPAs that are greater than 100,000 square kilometres, we're number 7 on the list. So there's a huge number of large ones being set up right around the world by a number of countries, as you can see here. Cook Islands, the British, New Zealand, Kiribati, United States, Chile, everyone's getting into this large MPA approach. The reality, though, is that if you look at the dates, they've all been set up since 2006. And very few of them, as I said, other than the Papahanaumokuakea, have any real idea of large-scale management. And they're all looking for the Great Barrier Reef to give that guidance. How do we plan? How do we manage? So in Chapter 1, as I said, I'll have an introduction, set the scene, but I really want to give it, as a qualitative chapter, a descriptive account of these large MPAs. And as I said, there's similarities and there are differences from the Great Barrier Reef, because there are many differences. I want to talk about the current management arrangements and talk about the key lessons learned, particularly from the Great Barrier Reef, that will assist other MPAs. In terms of progress in this chapter, I've started my literature review. There's a group, as I said, called Big Oceans, and they had a workshop recently, and they're preparing best guidance guidance for large MPAs around the world. They're hoping to launch that next year at the World Parks Congress in 2014 in Sydney. So Gabronpa is a major contributor to those guidelines, and I've commenced collating information. So I think I'm about 20% on that progress on that chapter. In terms of the second chapter, the key components of the representative areas program, I've mentioned what were the key elements that contributed to the success, but more importantly, what are the implications of these key elements for different MPAs and for our next rezoning? As I said, there's been a fair bit written on this, Leanne, and a lot of people have written a fair bit about the components, so I'm relatively lucky. I've got a lot of information. So this chapter, again, largely qualitative, will be a descriptive account of those different elements, the entire process, perhaps what hasn't been well articulated in the literature so far is the genesis. How did we actually even get to decide we needed a representative areas program? And then some of the stuff that's happened more recently, implementation lessons learnt. Again, I want to concentrate on the lessons learnt for other MPAs. In terms of progress, I'm lucky enough to have already published a little bit in this area. As I said, there's a lot of literature out there. One of the things I'm keen to talk about are the decision support systems, what role they did and did not play, because a lot of people are focusing on things like Mark Sand. What did that do in terms of the zoning of the Great Barrier Reef? I've been lucky enough to been asked to prepare a chapter for a book on marine spatial planning. So I'll, in that, draw on a lot of these lessons, not just from the zoning alone, but from all our planning. So this one, I think I'm about 25% complete in terms of my progress. The third chapter, I think this is getting into the really nitty-gritty, the important stuff. This is where I want to look at the relative roles of science, leadership and politics. So questions like, how fundamental was the scientific underpinning? I said before, I thought it was fundamental. I want to demonstrate that. How important was leadership? Again, I think this was a fundamentally important part, but it hasn't been brought out well in the literature so far. And what were the key political realities? And here I'm going to concentrate on a number of players, political players, both the politicians and others. So say, for example, David Kemp was the minister who was in charge when we put the rezoning through Parliament. He was a key politician. Deanne Kelly was another key one along the coast here who had a very strong views on the representative areas program. But equally important were other key political players. These aren't politicians, but they were heads of key groups, and they played a really important role when it actually got through the various processes. So on the right-hand side, Imogen Zethoven, and on the left, Ted Loveday, both were key players in terms of the overall political process for RAP. Small p political there. Again, there is some good literature out there talking about things like leadership and politics, and I'll draw upon that. In terms of how I propose to do this, I'm looking at both a quantitative and qualitative approach. So I mentioned a literature review, looking at things like the comparison of the roles of science and leadership and politics. But I'm also keen to actually interview some of those political players that I mentioned. The way I'm proposing to do that, I'm preparing a structured interview with around about, I'm hoping, 10 politicians, what I'm calling 10 political players, and I've got another 5, what I'm calling political advisors. So around about 25 people. I'm hoping to do all those interviews face-to-face. I think it'll be much more effective if I can sit down and eyeball them. Many of those people I know well enough to ask them. A couple who I don't know well enough, I'm hoping that the ones I do will help me with that interaction. Obviously, I've got to have informed consent and talk about issues of confidentiality. I'm keen also to use this opportunity to talk about questions that are relevant to other parts of the thesis, not just the politics and leadership. So I want to try and draw out their views on other parts. And at the end, I'm hoping to have some unstructured questions to allow them to talk. Clearly, this is going to require ethics approval, so I've commenced that process, and I'm hoping once I've completed it to analyse it using in vivo. In terms of progress to date on this chapter, I've looked at some of the literature. I've completed a comparison of how politicians differ from scientists and managers, and that was already showing very different approaches. For example, their drivers, their timeframes, all the things that politicians are pushed and driven by. The language they use is totally different to how managers talk, and again, totally different to how scientists talk, etc. So I think that analysis is important. As I mentioned, I've compiled my list of who I want to interview, and I've started preparing my questions. I'm lucky Nadine Marshall, who many of you know, is an expert in this area, and she's on my committee, and she's helping me with this area. I think I'm about 10% down that track. In terms of my fourth chapter, Again, this is, I think, a really important one. How effective was the rezoning and the RAP in protecting what we now know exists in the Great Barrier Reef? So this is not just about protecting the biodiversity, but I also want to focus on things like the ecological processes. Again, the rezoning was designed specifically to better protect biodiversity, but today we recognise it has to do more than just that. So I want to look at other things as well as just the known habitats and species. However, we're lucky. Considerable extra work has happened in the Great Barrier Reef since the rezoning came into effect. We know a lot more about particularly the areas outside the shallow coral reefs. And so I've got some literature listed there, but it's probably better to show you some maps, which I'll do in a minute. Things like the mesophotic reefs, the work that Peter Harris and Tom Bridge, many of you know Tom here. The deep water features, again, Peter Harris and Rob Beeman have now mapped a lot of these important deep water features. We now recognise how important they are in terms of the overall functioning of the Great Barrier Reef. We found cold water corals that we didn't even know about when we did the rezoning in the very deep water parts. We're looking at the interreefal areas much more closely, or have done so, with CSIRO Roland Pitcher. And people from AIMS like Hugh Sweetman and Mike Kappa are also looking more closely at the reefs themselves. So this chapter will have two parts. A largely quantitative part will be analysis of those new features, that new understanding, that we've now discovered since the rezoning, and comparing it to how much we know does occur in the existing zones and the existing zoning network. Just to remind you, that's what the bioregions just offshore Townsville here looks like. If you keep your eye on this area around Cape Bowling Green, you can see the non-reef bioregions. We had one here, and then a lagoonal one, and then one around the mid-shelf reefs and deep water. But if we move on to the new information, this is work done by CSIRO, the Seabed Biodiversity, and again in that same area you can see much more information known and much finer detail. So that's interreefal areas. If we look at bathymetry, again much better information is known today. Rob Beeman and his colleagues have done a huge amount of work, not only in the shallow areas and better mapping into the shallow bathymetry, but certainly in the deep water, way offshore. And Rob has now discovered huge offshore deep water features that we didn't know about, again, are really important for the overall functioning of the Great Barrier Reef. And as I said, people like Tom Bridge, in conjunction with Peter Harris and a whole raft of people, have done a lot of work on these mesophotic reefs. And again, we now recognise how important those areas between 50 metres and sort of 150 metres are to the overall functioning of the Great Barrier Reef. I'm lucky that both Tom and Alana are key co-authors on a paper and they've done an analysis. They've identified what they've seen as 38 habitats and assemblages in this area that's outside the shallow coral reefs. 9 interreefal habitats, 16 assemblages. They're effectively in that seabed biodiversity area. And then 13 other key habitats that are mainly in the deep water. Most of those 38 turn out are pretty well protected. So the approach we used, the precautionary and systematic approach, have protected basically all the new information we know today. So mesophotic reefs, over 30% are protected. Canyons, 38. Plateaus, 59. However, we've identified 5 habitats and assemblages that are less than 20%. And that 20% was one of our planning principles. I've just listed the ones here. And you'll notice that some of them, 19.5%, are pretty close. But others, like these deep water terraces here, down at 7.6%. So we obviously, in that case, didn't know enough about it and weren't able to pick that up. But it's important when we're looking at this is the percentage in green zones, to also recognise that other zones play a role in protecting biodiversity. So in this case, we've got 27% of the Assembly's 12 is in the habitat protection zone. So that does a huge amount to protect the biodiversity as well. So this chapter, how effective was it? I also want to look at other values, things like heritage values. Many of you are aware of the importance of the Great Barrier Reef for both Indigenous heritage and historic heritage. So this chapter is going to have a section that's qualitative. What zoning can and cannot do, and certainly what can zoning do for protecting heritage values. In terms of progress, Tom and Alana have done a fair bit of the data analysis already. We've started, as I said, compiling the text for a paper, and the preliminary results, as I said, the current zoning network does provide adequate protection for virtually all the habitats, but certainly not for all the heritage that we know. It also reinforces that importance of that systematic and precautionary approach to the way we did our rezoning. and the need for adaptive management. As we find more information, we need to continually improve. So this chapter about 25% complete. Chapter 5, Key Misunderstandings, Legacies and Challenges. I think this is really important. How does the zoning relate to those wider conservation efforts? And I mentioned before, zoning doesn't address all the pressures. But what are some of those key misunderstandings and legacies, not just from the zoning, but from all our planning and management? And perhaps the best way I can illustrate this, I get asked this question a lot when I travel overseas. What's the relationship between Gabrumpa's zoning and marine spatial planning? People say, we don't quite understand. Or things like ecosystem-based management. And the way I explain to people, I say, look, ocean zoning is one of our fundamental tools, but ocean zoning is only one part of our approach to marine spatial planning. There are many other marine spatial planning tools. I've listed some of them there. I'll show you some of those in a minute. But the other important point to stress to people is the coastal zone management, because of so much of what's affecting the Great Barrier Reef is actually coming off the land. And so what I stress to people, it's all these things together that gives us our ecosystem-based approach to management. And I think we've got to keep stressing that for a lot of MPA managers around the world. If I can just show you that by illustrating. This is the zoning plan offshore Townsville. That's the one that's now currently in law. If I overlay on top of that zoning plan, for example, the shipping lanes, which again, these are in law, they're a statutory part of the zoning plan, they sit on top of the underlying zoning. And so you can see here that ships can come into Townsville here, into the port area that's excluded from the park, but they go across the green zone, the blue zone, etc. So the shipping lanes, whilst they're in law, is another layer on top. If we talk about plans of management, this is yet another statutory layer that sits on top of the zoning. This is one of many several plans of management we've got in the marine park for high use, or in this case, a high conservation area. So this is again a statutory plan, but it's sitting on top of the underlying zoning. Another example is the defence training areas, and this is one of many in the Great Barrier Reef. We've got 7 training areas. In this case, this is both a spatial management and a temporal. It's in law, and when it's in effect, effectively that's a no-go area. You cannot go through that area when that training area is being used. That only occurs for about a week a year. For the rest of the time, it's open, and you can transit through that area. So again, the underlying zoning is critical. This is another layer that's actually really important for management. This is the sea country agreement we've negotiated with the traditional owners, in this case for the Girrigan area, Girrigan Sea Country. And they've developed a TUMRA, a Traditional Use of Marine Resource Agreement, which they brought to government, which is now accredited by both the federal government and the state government. And again, that gives it a legal backing, which says how they're going to manage their sea country. So again, it's a legal framework that sits on top of the underlying zoning. If you were to put all these spatial layers together, it'd get incredibly complex. Clearly, we don't do that in terms of showing to the public, but as managers, all those spatial layers are part of what we do. So it's very much a three-dimensional approach to management. So I'm keen in the chapter here to correct some of those misunderstandings and to explain to people the complexities of management. I think there's another whole series of concepts that need to be better explained, and rather than go through each of these, let me just pick one or two. If we talk about the first one, zoning by objective rather than by activity, again, many people overseas say we want a zoning network, we're going to have a no fishing zone and a shipping zone and a port zone. We don't do that in the Great Barrier Reef. We zone by objective. So say, for example, in the general use zone, which basically says all reasonable uses can occur provided it provides for conservation of the Great Barrier Reef. That's what that zone is about. So it allows shipping, it allows trawling without a permit to occur, as long as they comply with their other regulatory basic requirements. It does require some things to have a permit. So say, for example, tourism and research still requires a permit in the general use zone. But we've got a list of things that can occur without a permit, a list of things that with a permit, but it's not on that list, it cannot occur. There is, however, a little extra provision that says any other purpose consistent with the objective of the zone. This is for things we haven't even thought of. So this approach to zoning is much more effective than saying we're going to have a fishing zone and a shipping zone and a research zone, etc. So zoning by objective, again, I don't think many people understand quite how we do it. The other key one, which I don't think many people focus on when marine protected area managers, they need to think outside their marine areas when they're managing. Not just only up on the land, but basically if all around their marine protected area is getting overfished or polluted, then their marine protected area won't be viable in the long term. So I think there's many concepts in this paper that need to be addressed. So this chapter, I believe, largely qualitative, talking about those key legacies, talking about those key challenges and misunderstandings, and clarifying clearly to people what the zoning can and cannot do for marine conservation. This is a chapter I think I'm furthest along. I've got a fair bit of text drafted, and I've got a number of figures already prepared. In terms of Chapter 6, what lessons from the RAP need to be considered for the next zoning program? Basically, I think there are a number of lessons, but the important thing is, when do we need to think about these? Some of them are probably more important in terms of timing than others. And what do we need to do to think about protection of all the values? This is important, and I'll explain why, because of new legal requirements. There is a fair bit of written about the old zoning, but there's a lot of things that we haven't yet discovered. If I talk about, for example, enforcement, and if you just look at that area at the end of Cape Bowling Green Bay, we put in place this yellow zoning around the edge of the spit to allow for people to fish off the edge of the Bowling Green Bay spit. And that was fine for a number of years. However, over time, that spit, being a mobile bit of the coastline, has actually moved, and today the tip of the spit actually extends into the green zone. So people walking along that and fishing off the end are now fishing illegally in the green zone. So there are some elements of enforcement, particularly in mobile coastal areas like this, that we need to rethink how we apply our zoning principles. There's also, as I said, legislative requirements that we now need to consider. Since the 2003 zoning, there's been amendments to the Act talking about what we need and we have to do if we're considering another rezoning. So there are requirements that we have to consider before we even do a zoning plan. Things like we have to consider environmental, economic and social objectives. Things like after the zoning plan, we have to do a statement of the effects of those environmental, economic and social effects. We have to do a statement of how the planning principles were addressed. So it's a lot more legally rigorous than when we did our previous zoning. In addition, there are now additional objectives that we have to consider when we do our zoning, and this includes World Heritage values. Again, it wasn't even one of the considerations when we did the first or the 2003 zoning. So this chapter is largely qualitative, an interpretive and a descriptive comparison of the lessons learnt from the previous zoning and the implications that I think need to be considered prior to and during the next zoning. I'm keen to interview people like Leanne and others who are around, who knew and went through it, because I think it's important to get their perspectives as we think for the future. In terms of progress, I've completed an assessment of the legal requirements. I've got access to a list that we've been keeping in Brompa since the 2003 zoning of the issues that we need to address, and I've started talking to some of those people involved in the previous zoning. In terms of the last chapter, conclusions, what are the significant findings? What are the needs and prospects for future research? Basically, I haven't started that one yet, as you'd think. So, in terms of moving on with a PhD, there are some mandatory requirements. These are all addressed in my project plan. Probably the one of most importance for people in this room would be the ethical considerations, and I have to go through formal ethics approval, particularly for those interviews. In terms of publications, my intent is to take the draft chapters and try and produce publications. So of those 7 chapters, I'm proposing at the moment 6 key publications. And I'd just like to take you through those in order. The first one is the one I'm working with in terms of Alana and Tom Bridge. I've titled it tentatively, Effective Marine Conservation Planning in the Absence of Perfect Data. I think this is a really important one to point out to people. They don't need to wait for perfect data to zone. I'd like to aim for something like +1 for that, but equally I think it's important that with all these papers, I also aim to get a second version or a simple version into something like MPA News. It's the managers around the world who need to understand these sorts of outcomes. The second publication I've talked about there, as I mentioned earlier, I've been invited to put a chapter in a book. The book is entitled Transboundary Marine Spatial Planning in International Law. So my chapter will be on marine spatial planning in the Great Barrier Reef. In terms of my third and fourth publications, I think one called Effective Planning and Management of Large MPAs is an important one. It's already being written up for those IUCN best practice guidelines, but I'd like to also try and write a paper for something like ocean and coastal management. My fourth one, Misconceptions about ocean zoning and its relationship to marine spatial planning and ecosystem-based management, lessons from the GBR. Again, I think there's 2 phases of this, or 2 aspects. I'm really keen to get it into scientific literature, something like aquatic conservation, but I'm equally keen to get it into something like MPA News for managers to recognise those misconceptions. The last two, relative roles of science and leadership and politics. Aim high. I'd like to try and get an opinion piece in science if I could, but if that falls over, then obviously I'd like to get it into a journal. And the last one, key considerations for the next rezoning. Again, aim for a scientific journal, but also try and get it into MPA News. In terms of expected outcomes, I'm hoping that I can make some key contributions. Things like reinforcing, as I said before, the importance of the systematic and precautionary approach to conservation planning. This can ensure protection of things that we do know now, and even the things we haven't even discovered, as I demonstrated. I really want to reinforce the need for adaptive management. These plans and approaches have to be done and then come back and do it again. Many countries do a plan and then put it on the shelf and think they've done their planning. We need to have an adaptive management approach. I want to clarify, as I said, many of those misunderstandings about particularly how we do our planning and management. I certainly want to demonstrate that the scientific underpinning is fundamental, but the importance of both leadership and politics. I don't think people around the world understand just how fundamental those are to get an effective outcome, effective network. I also want to talk about the lessons, not just from the zoning, which is really important, but from all our planning approaches, whether it's the plans of management, whether it's our strategic approach, the strategic plan that we did in 94, or even the strategic assessment. All these are planning instruments, and I think there's lessons for elsewhere around the world. And I want to demonstrate key areas where I think further work is required in the Great Barrier Reef. And the two that I've identified already, and I think, again, this is reinforced in the strategic assessment, cumulative impacts. Everyone talks about it. It's really hard to try and address. And the second one, ecosystem goods and services. Again, it's a phrase used a lot, but I don't think we've done a good job. We're moving towards it. The work that Maya Gooch and Nadine and others are helping us move in that direction, but I think we've got a lot of work more to do on ecosystem goods and services. In terms of likely impact factor of this work, we've all heard of journal impact factors, and that's important. But I'm also hoping that the true impact of my research will be measured by things like the number of managers around the world who use the results to improve their management. I'm hoping the impact of this work may have impact on both policy and practice, and I'm hoping that the social, environmental and economic benefits of improved management is something that may result. Again, aim high. In terms of a project plan, this is over the 2.5 years. I've got it on 2 slides. Effectively, I'd like to try and conduct my interviews next year. Well, not try, I'm aiming to conduct my interviews. And I'm also aiming to finalise 4 of my publications in the next 12 months. 2 of those are well in hand. And then the second part, to the end of 2015, finalise my publications and use those, or the work I've done on those, to write my actual thesis and then submit it. Is it ambitious? Absolutely. Is it achievable? I believe it is. Progress to date, just to finish off, there is a number of things you have to go through, obviously, for a PhD. Some of them, like the online ethics stuff, I've only partly completed. It's a lot more complex when I started doing it than I realised, so I'm working assiduously through it. These are the sort of things I'm working through. Just to finish off, in anything like this, there's a lot of people I have to thank. Some of them are in the room here, but I certainly want to thank Helene, Bob, Liz and Nadine for their guidance, but there's a lot of other people. So on that note, I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.